This week we are going to talk about the news from August 18th to 25th, I believe. Or is it 26th? What day is it today? Today's 27th. It's till 26th. So August 18th to 26th, which is definitely more than a week, because when I procrastinate, it hurts me more because then I have more news to cover for y'all. And also, my mom has recently started helping me collect news. Originally it was to decrease my workload, but to be honest, now I have more things to share with you. We're getting into it. Hey y'all, it's Becky here from the Beckisphere, where we talk about climate news and solutions. You've entered the weekly climate recap, where we discuss what is being done to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So if I'm looking down here, it's because my iPad is down here. I still haven't fully figured out how to do the teleprompter thing with my camera, so bear with me. All right, let's go ahead and get into the news, which starts with major oil companies and the American Petroleum Institute suing the White House for halting drilling auctions on federal lands and waters this year, which was one of the things that Biden said he would do when he became president. So they're suing him for it, and they are saying that the government is required by law to hold regular sales. In response, the U.S. has started doing leasing again. They are starting with an auction for offshore drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. In the Offshore Technology Conference, the newer oil industries such as Ghana, Brazil, Guyana, and Suriname laid out their plans to pump massive oil and gas to reform their economies. Apparently, the idea of decreasing climate change to save their economies was not on the list. I'm going to go ahead and let the World Health Organization public health director respond to that idea.
I mean, for certain time, the argument of you need to pollute if you want to develop economically has been used. And even some countries were saying, oh, I cannot stop my emissions rate because I need to develop. And you Europeans, you did it. So now you cannot stop me to do it. This is, with all due respect, but I think it's a nonsense argument. I mean, first, I think all countries should learn from the bad experience we have in Europe. Everybody remember London so polluted but now you look at the Scandinavians, they are very well developed economically, and they are not polluting their environment and therefore their health. So I think those models exist, and this argument that if I want to develop, I need to pollute are wrong. So I think it's time now to say, okay, if the environmental arguments were not strong enough, let's now look at the health arguments, and therefore public health would require a different speed that climate change, environmentally related, have been demonstrating until now.
The Calder Fire has joined the Dixie Fire in decimating Northern California. The Dixie Fire smoke has disrupted school systems in Nevada, and fires are also still burning in Southern California, Oregon, Washington, Montana, Idaho, and Minnesota. And in the rest of the world, wildfires are still scorching Siberia, Greece, Canada, France, and Paraguay. Oh, and Israel. And I haven't really looked into each event to determine how unusual each one is. So if anyone would like to do that, feel free to let me know in the comments below. Researchers at Harvard University have connected an increased rate of COVID infections with wildfire smoke. They estimated that there were nearly 200,000 extra COVID infections and 750 COVID deaths in areas exposed to wildfire smoke between March and December last year in the American West. A new study from Stanford University found exposure to wildfire smoke can increase premature birth risk, possibly causing an additional 7,000 premature births in California between 2007 and 2012, premature being earlier than 37 weeks. Meanwhile, there has been deadly flooding in North Carolina after Tropical Storm Henry has flooded Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New York, and Connecticut. Monsoon rains in Arizona knocked down some of Trump's border wall. Tennessee is also experiencing deadly flooding after 15 inches of rain fell in 6 hours. And us Californians, we can't even imagine that. We can't even imagine 1 inch falling. As you can see, there's like too much of a thing on different parts of the country right now. There has also been flooding in Sudan, South Korea from Typhoon Omayas, Mexico from Tropical Storm Grace, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Nigeria, Singapore, Malaysia, Ghana, Sri Lanka, India, and Sweden. Again, I have not looked into each of these events to see how unusual each of them are, so if someone would like to do that, go ahead and let me know in the comments below. Oh, and by the way, also, the European floods were at least 20% worse because of climate change, according to a attribution study. You can read more about that in the resources section below. A Bloomberg intelligence study found that only 11 of the top 46 mining companies in the world have emissions reduction goals that are ambitious enough to keep the Earth under 2 degrees Celsius of warming. Yeah, we're not even worried about 1.5 anymore. We're now just trying to get to 2, and that's already not looking good. Only one company plans to hit carbon neutrality by 2030, and only 14 have plans to reach net zero by 2050. And so, kind of ironically, the company that is planning to hit net zero by 2030 is actually an Australian company called Fortescue Metal Group Ltd. I don't remember what Ltd stands for. Australian company, that's interesting considering how the rest of Australia or the Australian government has been lagging on climate policies. It's interesting that the best mining companies' emissions targets are in Australia. Okay, fair enough. A large Alaskan drilling project by ConocoPhillips has been blocked by a federal judge in Alaska, which cites inadequate environmental assessments. The project, called Willow, had been given the green light by the Trump administration and even legally approved by the Biden administration, but environmental activists were not having it. The White House has not responded to this ruling. An Earth Justice lawyer had this to say, quote, "This is a resounding win for our clients and the climate. The court's decision vacates the Trump administration's decision approving the Willow project, and we hope the Biden administration takes this opportunity to reconsider the project in light of its commitments to address the climate emergency." Finland's energy company Fortum is accelerating its coal plant closure of almost 40% of its global coal-fired energy generation. IKEA has started to sell renewable energy, which my dad says, I hope they're not just going to give us individual parts to screw in. IKEA itself has a goal of decreasing its emissions by 50% by 2030. IKEA's new retail business manager had this to say, quote, "At IKEA, we want to become fully circular and climate positive by 2030, built on renewable energy and resources. We believe the future of energy is renewable, and we want to make electricity for sustainable sources more accessible and affordable for all." You can learn more about this by clicking the link in the source section below. A new report by the nonprofit Earthworks found that there has been enough flaring in Texas to provide energy for 15 million homes. Flaring is basically when fossil fuel plants, instead of using that gas, they just kind of release it into the atmosphere, burn it off. But it requires a permit usually to do that, and the report found that 68 to 84% of the flares that they located were not permitted. This means that any emissions data for that area is majorly underestimating the actual situation. The report accuses Texas of not properly holding fossil fuel companies accountable for their emissions. There's ways for them to see those flaring activity. They could call them out on it, but the IPCC report made it clear that dropping methane is a low-hanging fruit that could really easily decrease our climate impact. One report says that halting methane emissions could avoid 1/3 of the global warming expected. So it's really important that we stop these flaring activities. So several efforts have stepped up to catch methane leaks by fossil fuel plants. There's the Copernicus Sentinel-5 precursor that can see methane leaks from space. In 2019, a Harvard postdoc saw a huge amount of leakage in between Texas and New Mexico in an area known as the Permian Basin. The Permian Basin is one of the largest oil producing sites in the world. The researcher estimated that 2.9 million metric tons of methane leaks into the atmosphere each year from that one spot, producing as much emissions as the whole state of Florida. This would be over twice as much as the US government is currently reporting. And then there's what we call methane hunters, like Sharon Wilson, who literally went out and got her own infrared camera to catch fossil fuel plants in the act. I recommend reading her story and different efforts to catch leaks by clicking on the link in the source section below, because there's a lot there, but it's really interesting and some badass people involved. And while things are getting hotter due to climate change, Texan Republicans are working to remove protections that allow workers a 10-minute water break every 4 hours. They would basically strip municipalities of the ability to regulate employment benefits and policies, which will also stop cities from being able to mandate any COVID regulations. Democrats in Texas have currently fled to other locations so they don't have to vote for it. And now the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality has begun rolling out money for clean air initiatives under the Texas Emissions Reductions Plan created by the Texas Department of Transportation. But 35% of those funds for the plan is allocated to widening highways for congestion mitigation. From experience in California, widening highways doesn't reduce congestion, it just allows more cars on the road, from personal experience. In addition to that, unless all those new single cars are going to be EVs, why aren't we just spending money on electric public transportation instead to solve the congestion issue? It seems a little contradictory if we're trying to fund reducing air pollution while also increasing highway occupancy. Recently, an investigative report by NPR and Columbia Journalism Investigations found that the 3-year average of heat-related deaths has nearly doubled since the early 1990s, and this has impacted workers of color particularly hard. Even though they got this information by looking at data from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, known as OSHA, OSHA hasn't issued national heat standards since 1972 and has done a relatively poor job reinforcing any rules, according to the investigative report. The Union of Concerned Scientists warns that under a scenario where emissions don't peak until 2040, outdoor workers will be exposed to over 100-degree temperatures 3 times more often than they are now. Without protections in place, this would wreak social and economic havoc. India is set to exceed emissions cuts and boost its clean energy generation before its promises. It's likely that by 2025, clean energy will represent 40% of India's energy generation. However, to get much further, they said that they would need some funding from developed countries to increase their clean energy generation. Solar power in the EU during June and July represented 10% of its solar consumption. This is still less than coal energy generation, though, which represents 14% of their energy consumption. The EU has set a goal of 40% clean energy generation by 2030. Meanwhile, in the US, the American Clean Power Association reported a 17% increase in energy capacity compared to the first half of 2020. And 73% of that happened in this second quarter of the year, so very recently. Battery storage growth has already surpassed the whole of 2020 for the first half of this year. And the amount of battery storage is set to grow fast in the next few years, as you can see from this graph. The Swedish venture HYBRIT will be the first to deliver coal-free or green steel to its client. Its client is the truck maker Volvo, and it plans to run trials with this new form of steel before it hits the market in 2026. Steel is one of the most emissions heavy and also difficult to reduce emissions industries. It currently represents 8% of global emissions. But the reason why it's so hard to decarbonize this technology or this industry is because in order to make steel, you need a hot temperature to do so, and it's a lot easier to produce hot temperatures using fossil fuels than it is to produce it via clean energy. So that's one of the reasons why steel, as well as like cement and concrete, are really hard to decarbonize. But smart people are working on it. Germany is set to hit its highest emissions rise since the year 1990, meaning that we should see a spike in emissions data for that year in the overall dropping emissions record. So this year will only be 38% lower than 1990 levels, whereas last year they reported a 40% drop compared to 1990 levels, which was their goal, to hit a 40% drop compared to 1990 levels by the year 2020. So they did just hit that score, but now it's gone down. And they say that one of the main reasons why it even hit 40% was because the pandemic shut everything down. So scientists say that we would have been in an even worse predicament if we didn't ban chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, in the 1987 Montreal Protocol. The reason why we banned it is because CFCs are a powerful chemical that had been breaking down the ozone layer, creating the ozone hole that we saw over the Antarctic. But apparently they're also a very big greenhouse gas as well. So we did good with that. And now we need a cat break that he didn't ask for. Hi Rue, how's it going? How's the state of Rue? Did you enjoy your snacks? Are you happy with your food? How is life? What are you looking at? Say thank you, Rue, for giving us a little happiness in this news segment. Yay! Canadian Wall Street analysts are advising their clients to invest in Canadian tar sands, betting against environmental activists and Indigenous group efforts to halt Line 3 and Trans Mountain expansion. They're still choosing to bet on oil from tar sands, even though they recognize the environmental impact and the fact that OPSEC, which is direct competition for Canadian oil, has been ramping up their supply. And they are supporting it even though countries are starting the trend towards clean energy. So basically, they're very, very confident. And they had the right to bet high on the tar sands because yesterday Minnesota Supreme Court declined to hear the arguments of environmentalists and Indigenous groups arguing against the Line 3 project. So basically they're letting the Line 3 project continue. According to a report by Dismog, which does really great work, I will say, 1 in 3 directors at Australia's top banks have ties to oil, gas, and mining. These banks have supplied over $30 billion to fossil fuel companies since the Paris Agreement was signed. GM is recalling about 73,000 Chevy Bolts after a few battery fires were reported. And even though it is completely normal for diesel-powered cars to experience recalls, it's going to be used by dissenters of EVs to argue against the transition, especially bad right after the White House had agreed with GM and other car companies to move towards 40 to 50% EVs representing the sales market by 2030. So, What is interesting though is GM is committed to still spending $25 billion on EVs and autonomous vehicles through 2025. And what's also interesting to note is GM's future models of EVs will come with Ultium battery propulsion systems, which is actually a different system than the one that is being used in those Chevy Volts now. So, Science Moms, which is a nonpartisan group of scientists and mothers, is launching a $4 million digital ad campaign targeting suburban moms in key swing states ahead of the 2022 midterm elections. The ads are aimed at explaining extreme weather events and how they are impacting families around the nation. And here's a quote from one of their ads. Quote, "Our window to act on climate change is like watching them grow up. We blink and we'll miss it." The $4 million campaign is part of a larger $10 million fund from a nonpartisan pro-climate action marketing group called Potential Energy Coalition. The U.S. Treasury passed a new policy pressing multilateral development banks to stop funding natural gas exploration and production. However, they would still support projects that are further down in development, which includes pipelines, as long as they meet certain standards. The Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, announced $20.4 million in grants to airports that use zero-emission vehicles and electrify equipment that is currently run on fossil fuels. This funding is part of a larger $30 million being spent by the FAA on zero emissions and electrification. Coal is thriving and shooting us past pre-pandemic emission levels fast. Well, we're already past them. Great. The environmental think tank Ember found that China and Mongolia have increased emissions and coal production the most, but coal-producing countries around the world have been following this trend. For the first time in recorded history, it rained on Greenland's ice sheet summit, according to the National Science Foundation's Summit Station. Normally, it's too cold for rain to fall there, but Greenland has stayed above freezing for 9 hours. Melt from Greenland's ice sheets are expected to cause the highest level of sea level rise out of any melting body. So, yikes. A new study found that autonomous electric taxis are not going to fix climate change, as some might think, in the transportation sector, unless they are ride shares, because convenience of individual rides would actually increase the reliance on those technologies and therefore increase the reliance on the energy sector. So EVs would either need to be 55% cleaner than they currently are via the energy sector where they get their energy from, or over 75% of taxis would need to be ride shares. Right now, ride shares only represent 20% in the US. Denmark and Costa Rica are looking for more countries willing to finalize a phase-out time for oil and gas. The group would be called BOGA, Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. Okay, sorry, my camera died and now my light won't turn on in the back. So we're thriving, we're doing good. We're just So the Danish shipping firm Maersk announced that it's planning an order for 8 new cargo ships that run on biomethanol, also known as e-methanol, which is a mix between biomass and combining hydrogen atoms with carbon dioxide, which I think those things are supposed to cancel each other out because one takes in carbon dioxide and the other one releases carbon dioxide, but I'm not completely sure about that. Please, Dave from Just Have a Think, or Rosie from Engineering with Rosie, do a video explaining that to me. That'd be great. Maybe I should do a collaboration where they just kind of explain things to me, because sometimes I swear I don't have an engineering brain. So this technology is really expensive, but Maersk wants to send a message to the market about what the future should look like. Quote, "We don't believe in more fossil fuels. The company expects its new ships to start working in 2024. And last, I would like to leave you with some food for thought. CBS News wrote a piece about how climate change might have created a better environment for the Taliban to grow. So it might be a good video maybe for me to do, just specifically talking about the relationship between climate change and our current situation with extremist groups in the Middle East. Not that I really want to capitalize on the fact that that's a popular topic right now, but I think it's important to talk about the connection between those things, because there is definitely a connection between how environmental degradation leads to social unrest. So you can read the article that CBS News did in the resource section below. And I also put 3 action items in the resource section below. One involves an informational board game. So if you are a board gamer, check that out. And the other has multiple ways to piss off the fracking companies in the US. So one includes buying some land so they can't take it. So if that interests you, you can click on that resource section from Heated. So the first YouTube link in the resource section also gives a good breakdown on the current state of things globally and politically having to do with climate change. And the second link is specifically for Americans, talking about the current policies that are trying to be pushed through and what the 2022 midterm election could mean for climate action. So he does a really good job breaking those down, so please watch those 2 videos down below. And yeah, until next time, remember to talk about the climate crisis every single day and to support your local news organizations where a lot of this information first started. And I will see you all next time. Bye for now.